couple of questions for these guys. So hands way over there.
Thank you. Quick question. In respect to Scope 3 emissions, just last slide that you put up, you're mentioning that you've been partnering with stakeholders, peer colleagues in FM, customers, but is that a list of yours, including any of the manufacturers or any of the supply chain?
Chris, do you want to?
So is that a list of?
Manufacturers, for example, landscape industry. I think there is an issue with the tools and equipment that they use for the packaging for consumables and products. Are this part of your considered groups to be involved into developing?
At this stage, I mean, we've released kind of the foundation aspect of the report, and we're going deeper again. No, so we haven't gone into the products side. I guess there's a huge number of manufacturing products which is used within the different services of FM. Because you mentioned landscaping as one of those, then you have cleaning services, catering services, maintenance and repair services, etc., etc. So at this stage,
plan to onboard them?
Do we plan to? The project is, we're looking at a 3-stage project. We're on stage 1. There is potential that we can definitely go further and collect. Ultimately, the better the data that we collect, the more accurate the ability of the FM industry to measure its Scope 3 will be. So if we're able to, we will delve further and further. We've got to be mindful at this stage to be going into, I guess, rabbit holes, because measuring Scope 3, there are so many rabbit holes that you can go down. So we've got to start off at that kind of top level first, and then start to pick away at what's most material to the industry, and create the most accurate information as possible for those material elements, and then start to carve away at the big stuff. So we have to identify what that big stuff is before we delve into it. But yeah, thank you. That's a good suggestion.
It's a really solid question, because we talk a lot about the supply chain, and with whatever 175 services or so that broadly fall under the FM banner, that supply chain is just huge,
Exactly,
monumental, and how we're ever going to get into all of that, I'm
tired. I guess at this stage, because as you say, there are so many industries to think of. You got to look at a broad level of the industry, and there are factors which one can pick out, which are all based on estimations, which then help you to translate your spend in those industries into emissions. And so it's all based on very rough estimations at this stage in time. So as I mentioned, it's about identifying what the key opportunities are, and then starting to focus in on them.
And I think another piece that's interesting about it is, as you'd expect, BAM already report Scope 1 and 2, but we report that corporately. So it's not necessarily driven down to individual group companies like BAM FM, BAM Energy, or the different construction regions. It's a corporate reporting. But what Scope 3 requires us to do to give our customers the Scope 3 information is actually divide that information down to contract and service specific data that we can give them for them to apply. So even, you might say, and it's an easy first kind of knee-jerk kind of thought, is to say, well, you must be collecting Scope 1 and 2 data already. Well, yes, we are. But we do that as a corporate entity. So it's actually quite a big step to then say, well, our Scope 1 and 2, which is maybe mostly like a customer Scope 3, it's corporate-wide. It's not then directly linked to an individual task and an individual customer, or an individual location for an individual customer. And that's quite a step too. But I can imagine, like CAFM systems might become quite a focus of attention to gather data. So if we're sending an engineer to a job, we might be able to gather, and we probably should be able to gather how far that journey is by a vehicle. Ultimately, that would all have got rolled up into a Scope 1 emission corporately, but we could actually break down each one of those journeys, and effectively when we're supplying maybe an invoice, it could say, by the way, the driver drove this far in a transit van or maybe a self-charging hybrid, who knows? and this was the emission you can assume for that. And, you know, you can start maybe to understand how we could get into it, but again, customers are going to want from different suppliers consistency, and whether or not that's going to be entirely achievable, I guess we're on that journey now to try and identify that. What we're also going to do, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. So the greenhouse gas GHG protocol, there is a Scope 3 protocol with 15 kind of standard procedures. And what we're hoping to do is be able to apply those procedures to FM services in a way that is sort of complying with greenhouse gas protocol, but recognisable and consistent with the kind of services and the supply chain that we operate. So it feels familiar and it feels usable, if you see what I mean. It becomes a bit more applicable to what we're talking about. Is that true? That's true. I think that's true.
Got another question up the back here.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Thanks, Reid. Chris, Robert Cunningham from Equans here. I got maybe I'm going to be a bit controversial or about Scope 3, because my understanding was always that your Scope 3 emissions are someone else's Scope 1 emissions, Scope 1 and Scope 2, and therefore the level of effort, resource, data that you are going to gather Scope 3 is almost, is it worth it? Because, you know, if I don't catch the 7:48 from Gerrards Cross into London every morning, the train still runs. So, you know, great, I've not caught it, my carbon footprint's lower. But the amount of carbon isn't lower because the trains still run. So, isn't the point we should everybody, every organisation, focus on their own Scope 1 and 2, because that's what will make the difference, and then naturally your Scope 3 will reduce anyway, as opposed to putting all this effort into looking at Scope 3, because actually the impact you can make isn't in your sphere of influence to make.
So we mentioned earlier about, well, it's been mentioned a couple of times about, you know, what is the value of FM strategically. You know, we've mentioned about hygiene and you know, having those basic FM functions. So we believe that FM has a strategic importance to play in sustainability, and a key part of sustainability comes into this kind of net zero, in aligning in this net zero plan. But so in order to align with net zero of the customers, one needs to take as much responsibility to have an impact on its customers' emissions. And so if you're able to take that responsibility on, obviously, you know, you mentioned about taking the train's still going to run. That's an example of, yes, will that train still run? Fair enough. But also, you know, the grid of the train operating is also decarbonising, because that's the train operators purchasing the energy, or the power company delivering the energy, which causes the train, etc. But a lot of this that we're looking at goes into that supply chain management and understanding. And the supply chain, as Reid showed, has, you know, 90% of a company's carbon impact comes from that supply chain. And therefore, the FM is in a position where it can influence businesses to make their impact down that supply chain, because it's a purchasing company in its own right. And so this is what I mentioned about the trend. You've got your net zero plan, and then you've got your supply chain management trend. The organisations who are purchasing these goods and services are able to have an impact, because they're setting that customer demand to say, if you want to be working with us, you can start to reduce your carbon emissions. And that goes into your point about them reducing their Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So actually it all has a big interlinking effect. And so I would argue that the FM as an industry is able to make a wider impact if it's... Just getting to the best point. So yeah, the FM as an industry is able to make that wider impact because it is having an engagement, it's taking more responsibility and it's having more influence on those wider indirect emissions.
Can I come in there as well?
Yes, sorry, when you think you got it on silent, I'm sure that.
I'd like to respond to that as well. I know I'm an earlier speaker, but I'm going to come in. So yes, this is why you need expert help when you're doing your carbon and energy scope 1, 2, 3. 100% you need to be measuring your scope 3, and the way in which you set the boundary of your scope 3 is really important. So you have to make it credible. You have to make sure that you're comparing it the right way across your industry. Because it's fine to say, and I understand the point, theoretically the point being everybody has scope 1 and 2 emissions, but a tiny proportion of industry are measuring it at the moment. So if you are measuring it, you've got to include scope 3. But also the way in which you do business, and echoing what's already been said, the way in which you do business affects the amount of scope 3 emissions that you're responsible for creating. So if you require your leadership team to be in Manchester on a Monday morning, you have to account for how they're going to get there. If you allow them to do it via Zoom, you're then going to have a lower emissions. If you get your products from China or from the USA, it's a very different carbon impact than buying them from the UK or the EU. So it's the way in which you do business and the choices that you make that directly affect your scope 3 emissions, and that's why we count it. Because the idea is, by shining a light on that, we are then enabled to make better choices in our purchasing and our behaviour.
Thank you, Georgia. And I'm sorry, I've just been sent a photograph of what lunch looks like. So I'd like you to thank our two speakers here. Thank you very much indeed.